Welcome to Inspiring Women with Laurie McGraw. I am your host, Laurie McGraw. I have spent the past 30 years in leadership, and over the years, I've come to learn one thing. Women need women, and not just any women, but inspiring women. Tune in every week to hear from women at the pinnacle of their careers and from others who are just starting out. Episodes can be found at inspiringwomen.show or subscribe on your favorite podcast app. Thanks for listening, and I hope you will be inspired. Welcome to another episode of Inspiring Women. Today we are speaking with Susan Gross Sholinsky, and she is a partner and an attorney at the esteemed Epstein Becker Green firm. Now, Susan is an expert in workforce issues. She works on things like sexual harassment, working with companies and employers on things like discrimination, women's issues, LGBTQ issues. She has many positions at the firm, including vice chair of the Employment, Labor, and Workforce Management Steering Committee, the Diversity and Professional Development Committee. She also is responsible as part of the Executive Committee for the Women's Initiative. She also has been very active on global discrimination issues and board diversity, specifically focused on women. Recently, Susan was recognized as one of the top 100, 2020's Responsible 100 by New York State. This is an award bestowed upon private sector leaders whose work makes the life of better in communities in New York City and across the state. Susan went to Cornell. She received her law degree from Northwestern. And Susan, we're delighted to have you on Inspiring Women this morning. Thank you for being here.
Well, thanks so much for having me.
All right. Well, Susan, you're an expert, so let's just get started. These are going to be really interesting issues to talk about. You have a unique perspective, just given your strong experience in employment and the law. So can you give us a sense of what you do at the firm?
Sure. So aside from sort of the firm-related roles that you've mentioned, which is just, probably half my time, I really enjoy, helping sort of steer the firm with respect to, where my practice is going, where our women's initiative, our diversity, things are moving. So, that's a lot of my day. But with respect to my practice in particular, it's really just a fun practice. Before the pandemic, a lot of my work focused on helping employers develop their personnel policies and making sure those are compliant across all 50 states. The laws are coming fast and furiously in a lot of different areas now. I counsel on employee relations issues, discipline, discrimination, issues like unconscious bias, leaves of absence, accommodation of disabilities and pregnancy and medical related conditions. I conduct investigations. I draft all sorts of agreements. I provide a lot of sexual harassment prevention training and also a lot of training for our clients' managers on sort of how to be a good manager, not get yourself in trouble, to sort of issue spot all of the, leave accommodation type issues and, discipline issues, train a lot of our clients' HR staff on staying up to date on all the legal developments and trends, what they mean for our clients, what might be coming down the pike. I look at a lot of trends. Over the past year, for example, employers have become more sensitive to concerns about sort of racial issues, social injustice. And obviously, the pandemic has shined a light on a lot of things, including things like discrimination against Asian Americans, women's issues, and we'll get more into that sort of as we go on. But, this administration seems to be sort of leaning in aggressively on these issues. I think we're about to see, some more focus on the Me Too movement. And,
let's hope so. It has been an explosive year of change in this area. I have to imagine this pandemic, while it's upended almost everything that we do in this particular field in your practice, it has to have been just like an incredibly busy year. Before we sort of dive into some of those issues, which I really do want to talk more about, maybe Susan, just give us some background of like, how did you get here? How did you become so expert in in this area? Why was this of such great interest to you?
I think perhaps I just kind of fell into it a little bit. I actually had no thoughts of even going into, to law. Wound up going to the Cornell, Industrial and Labor Relations program, and that's a program that's at Cornell, and it sort of focuses on employment and business issues, including learning about things like economics and psychology, and really it's interesting. I mean, I tell people a lot that my work here is sort of half law, half psychology.
Mhm.
And it's just always been really very interesting to me. I get to spend a lot of time, talking to companies who really do want to do the right thing, and really just shaping their policies and procedures. When I do harassment avoidance training, it's interesting. It has sort of changed and become more interactive over the past couple of years since Me Too. People have, whether it's a selfish interest or whatever, it's definitely become more of a discussion, which is really great. So there's just so many aspects of what I do that just feel like, more than being just a lawyer.
Well, let's talk about harassment, because I think for most companies, sexual harassment training, it's mandatory. It's at least, what I've seen, it's conducted all over the place. And so that's good. But I think the things that we're reading about from the pandemic, it hasn't been fantastic for women in particular in professional careers, and sexual harassment is becoming more of an issue. The Me Too movement, which has many different sides to it, it's great to hear you say that that's going to be getting more attention. Let's just talk about sexual harassment. What are you seeing? And do you think companies are doing a good job? And maybe some of there are bright line issues, which I think we can all understand, but the more subtle issues is when something becomes sexual harassment. And what can women do in particular to avoid these issues?
I do think that people are taking this more seriously. People are making more complaints in the workplace. I think the newer generations are less shy about bringing something up when something is bothering them. And companies really are trying to sort of address these things, as they come up. It's interesting. I was doing sexual harassment training this morning, as a matter of fact, and somebody raised a question and said, sort of, well, what are there any obligations for people who just kind of are there and are seeing harassment go on? Like, what should they do? And I said, well, that's a great question. I said, managers on the one hand, really do have an obligation to address it, because once they see harassment going on, they really are on notice. But with respect to everybody else, it's interesting. The EEOC back in 2016, right before the Me Too movement, they came out with sort of this big diatribe on addressing sexual harassment in the workplace. And one of the things that they suggested in there, which is really a very good idea, and New York City has now required that to be part of its mandatory training, is being a good bystander. So they call it bystander intervention. And this is basically something that was borrowed from another unfortunate circumstance, which is rape on college campuses, where people would just sort of sit back and say, not my problem, I'm not getting involved. And that's obviously the wrong answer. So it's been extrapolated now to the workplace, and people are being encouraged through this training to address these issues, to support a victim when something inappropriate happens, to say, hey, if I'll head down to human resources with you. Do you need help? Or, look, if you're not ready to complain now, just know that I was a witness to that, and I'm happy to be your witness should you make a complaint later. Or to sort of shame the wrongdoer for engaging in the bad behavior. So, there's definitely more of a conversation about it today, than there really has been before.
So that's really interesting, Susan. But let's also talk about things like Zoom meetings. I've been reading a lot about just, people who are in that environment. Many people are spending, the majority of their days on Zoom meetings, but harassment is increasing. I was surprised by that. What are you seeing?
It never ceases to amaze me how, I say, I wish people would use their creativity for good instead of evil, right? They can't harass each other in the office, so people now figure out ways to harass each other on Zoom. It's interesting to me, whether people are just saying inappropriate things on Zoom. I kid you not, I had sexual harassment training the other day, and, in the background, in one of the boxes, it looks like I don't know, just a fun house in college, and there's people running around shirtless men, and like really,
Wow.
during sexual harassment training, I kid you not. So again, it's unfortunate, but unfortunately, sexual harassment doesn't go away. It just changes form when the technology is different, believe it or not.
So for women, it's great to hear that there is a bystanders, or there are people who are being trained and helpful, and allies perhaps for people. But what can individual women do when they notice it? And also, can you give some sense of where it becomes more the subtle issues, where it's the gray areas, and what women might do? So the casual comments about how you look, or what you're wearing, those kinds of things, which maybe, I don't know, I'm not the expert, borderline kinds of issues.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think a lot of people are just clueless. And I do think that to the extent that you are comfortable telling somebody that makes a comment that really, whether it's to you or to somebody else, that really they should think about what they're saying, and that might not be the most appropriate thing to say. It really just might go much further than you think it would. I've seen so many scenarios where the alleged perpetrator, right, when it turns into a complaint, when it really didn't have to, just has no idea. They thought they were being so nice by giving compliments to people. And if they had known that it bothered anybody, they just wouldn't have done it. So I think really having that conversation, if you're comfortable doing it, really just does go a long way.
Let's move to maybe a different type of issue. So you also do a lot of work in the area of payment audits, and clearly we know the statistics that women still are not at payment parity as men. So you audit companies, you do things of that nature, and women always ask me, whether it's on this podcast or elsewhere, how to negotiate for salary and know what they're worth. So what do you see? How do you advise companies, and what do you think women can do to advocate for themselves for payment parity?
Yeah, I mean, so I'll address this sort of individual one first. I mean, I do think that women, to the extent that they can train themselves in negotiation, they really should do so. A lot of women that I know are really much better negotiating for other people than themselves. And, to the extent that they learn better how to sort of utilize those skills and hone those skills for themselves, I think they would do a lot better. Instead of, for example, complaining about not getting the same pay as somebody else, really sort of going and affirmatively saying, look what I did for this company. I enhanced this, I made that better, I blah blah blah, and therefore I'd like to be recognized and compensated for it. I'd like a promotion and a pay raise, and if you get just one, hey, that's great. You got something. If you didn't ask for anything, you wouldn't have gotten anything. I do think that the salary history bans that are getting passed, all over the country, the concept at least is really good. This way, the concept behind them, right, is that if women have been discriminated against in the past in terms of their compensation, that basing their compensation at your company on their prior compensation, you're just really perpetuating the past discrimination. So, in many states and cities, employers are just no longer able to ask, what somebody earns at their current employer. They may be able to ask what it's going to take to bring you over. So again, there go the negotiation skills. You want to learn how to ask for something and maybe ask for more than what you think you might get, so that when you do negotiate, you wind up in a better place.
And how do you find out? So that's really terrific advice in terms of, changing of laws and what people can ask new applicants. But how can those applicants or people who are looking for something find out? Most women that I speak to, they don't really know what they're worth. And that's the constant question. How do I know what I'm worth? And it seems like, how you feel about compensation is more relative to what others are compensated, not always just what you individually are compensated at.
It definitely is tricky. I mean, there are certain places on the internet where you can look and see, where people are paid in your area, both geographically and with respect, to your business area. So to the extent that you can, find that out, that's great. Now, interestingly, There's pay transparency laws in many jurisdictions as well. Now, I don't know if others are going to necessarily tell you, what they're earning. But again, it's a generational thing. I will tell you that nowadays, a lot of people are sharing amongst one another, what they're earning, and they're allowed to do that. Employers actually can't tell them that they can't do it. It's actually always, been that way for non-managers since the National Labor Relations Act was passed in the 1940s. But many states have passed similar laws in the past 5 years or so that apply to not only non-managers but also managers, where people can actually share their compensation. So that is something you're allowed to talk about. But I would say, in relation to your question about pay audits, just the fact that these laws are out there and that the EEOC may be, coming back and requiring companies to report, more of their compensation. Some states have passed laws regarding that as well. Companies are spending more time thinking about it, and they are spending time justifying why person X is making more than person Y, and if there's not a justification, taking steps to fix it. So we definitely have seen employers, looking at these issues, and even if they don't go through a full pay audit themselves, again, sort of one-off fixes, I definitely see being made.
And the workforce, I will just say the human workforce, it's mobile right now. So people are staying in jobs for shorter periods of time before they might move to another company. So for the companies that you advise, those who are doing it well, what are the types of things that people should look for, for companies who are spending a lot of effort on these? These are complex issues. They've been around forever, but it's great to hear that there's real focus on them. My daughter, she's going to be looking to join some firm, after she graduates from her grad school. What should she look for in an employer that takes this work seriously, provides transparency? How would she find that out and know that this is a good place to work?
I think, as I said, there are certain things that are available on the internet, whether it's the websites that are reporting on, which companies are better than others. A lot of compensation discussions are sort of had there. You got to take those with a little bit of a grain of salt. But I think, looking at a company's website, right? Do they have an EEO statement? Do they have a diversity statement? Do they require training of their employees? Do they have employee resource groups? Do they have a women's initiative? Things like that are definitely things that you can look for when you're looking for a potential employer.
Those are great pieces of advice, Susan. I really appreciate that. As we close out this discussion, it's so interesting with all your expertise as you think about younger women who are trying to navigate their careers. What advice might you give just in some closing thoughts here?
Yeah, with the pandemic, there have been sort of a lot of issues, but I would say there is some sort of bright side as well. I think the fact that a lot of states and cities are passing, paid parental leave laws, I do think one of sort of the biggest game changers that I've seen out there is these laws, and the millennial men are just as likely to take 3 months off as women in terms of when they or their family members have babies. So honestly, I think that's going to be sort of a pretty big shift and pretty significant, more significant than a lot of other changes that we have seen. And I know that's not really advice. I guess really the advice would be, I guess, two things. Number one, to sort of take things sort of head on to the extent that there is any sort of a bad situation or something that doesn't sit right with you. Don't let it fester. Don't let it grow into something that maybe it wasn't even in the first place. Women, in my experience, maybe a little bit more sensitive about some of these things and sort of take the blame for things that are, that they shouldn't be taking the blame for. And I think talking to somebody about something that really could be a misunderstanding may just nip that in the bud and make it go away completely. And I would say also, your career is really a marathon, not a sprint. I think that some people, might think it's a sprint, but it really isn't. If something good doesn't happen every single day, that's okay. It might be the next day. It might be the day after. But I think just sort of sitting back and looking at it in the long term and the long run, might make people feel more comfortable.
Susan, this is just such great advice. I so appreciate you sharing your expertise with us here on Inspiring Women. This has been a fantastic conversation with Susan Gross Sholinsky. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for having me.
This has been an episode of Inspiring Women with Laurie McGraw. Please subscribe, rate, and review. We are produced by Kate Cruz at Executive Podcast Solutions. More episodes can be found on inspiringwomen.show. I am Laurie McGraw, and thank you for listening.